You have ruined this family. Vivian's voice was sharp and cold, like a glass shattering on a marble floor. The Earl Grey teacup had tipped over, and the hot liquid bled across the white tablecloth. The warm lamplight caught the string of pearls around her neck, glittering, yet utterly merciless. I stood there, still gripping the envelope of documents. My voice was low and steady. No, I just cleaned it up. A sudden draft blew the curtains back, and the wedding photo frame tumbled from the mantel. The once perfect wall now revealed a hairline crack, running vertically, like a scar left by time. Mark stood suspended between two women, the one who gave birth to him, and the one he had once sworn to protect. The air was so thick you could hear the distinct tick of the grandfather clock, counting the final seconds of a family dissolving. That was the day I understood. Love is not just about the light. It has darkness, it has power, and it holds the silence that slowly murders trust. If you have ever smiled to hide a crack in your own heart, then don't leave. Because after that fight, there was a truth no one in that house dared to face. Stay with me. Hear this whole story. And please subscribe so we don't lose each other on this journey. That evening, the gallery was hushed, filled with light reflecting off sheer glass. People moved softly, as if afraid to shatter the space. I stood beside my painting, a seam shrouded in mist, where a single beam of light seemed to be searching for its way home. He stopped in front of it and remained silent for a long time. A man in a charcoal gray coat, with a hint of sadness in his eyes. The way he tilted his head made me feel he wasn't just looking at the painting, but at the person who had created it. You paint light like someone who has lost it. That sentence, I will never forget it. Something in his tone made my heart slow down. I simply smiled and murmured, "Perhaps I have." The gallery lights washed over the glass, and I saw our two shadows overlapping, both real, and yet terribly fragile. That first light illuminated the illusion of love. It was the moment I started believing someone could truly understand the darkness within me, and still choose to stay. He was gentle, kind, in the way that touches the most profoundly lonely women. There were no elaborate speeches, just the way he poured me another glass of wine, or the way he listened without ever glancing at his watch. He spoke about his mother. "She's a little intense, but she means well." I nodded, barely paying attention. When in love, you often assume everything will sort itself out, as long as your intentions are pure. In those first few nights, we talked about books, music, and our shared affinity for old jazz. When Autumn Leaves started playing, he gently brushed my hand, so light, as if afraid to break a beautiful moment. His smile made me believe in goodness, made me believe that safety was a form of profound connection. I didn't know then that his gentleness was not strength. It was his way of avoiding all friction. But when you are desperate for peace, you mistake silence for understanding. I thought, perhaps this is the person I can lean on. The proposal came quickly, as if he feared that if he waited any longer, that light might vanish. It was a drizzly evening. He knelt in my small apartment, with only the sound of rain tapping against the window pane. I didn't cry. I simply placed my hand on his shoulder, hearing myself say, "Yes," unsure if it was for love, or just the feeling of being chosen. I thought, this time, perhaps I belong to a family. I believed happiness was something you could hold on to, as long as you believed in it long enough. Outside the window, the street lights cast long, wet streaks on the glass, reflecting my dream. A dream that began in light and would surely end in it. The wedding was small, held in a cozy space. The yellow lights enveloped the room, reflecting off the crystal glasses and the smiles of well-wishers I barely knew. I held my white bouquet, listening to the soft strains of autumn leaves, and thought, everything is so calm. This must be peace. Mark looked at me, the golden light settling on his face, making everything too perfect to doubt. When the officiant asked, "Do you take this man?" I looked down, seeing my shadow tremble slightly on the floor. For a fleeting moment I thought, if the light went out, would I even recognize the man standing next to me? Voiceover. I didn't know I was stepping into someone else's painting. A beautiful painting, painted with his mother's expectations, his own silence, and my own naive belief. After the ceremony, Mark pulled the car over on a tree-lined street. The wind was soft, and he spoke as if it were a minor detail. "Mom's getting older. Maybe we can stay with her for a while, just until she feels better." I looked at him, the light bouncing off the car window, catching his cheekbone. And in that light, I saw the man I had just chosen, and a part of myself desperately wanting to trust. I nodded, only saying, "If that's what you need." Inside, another voice whispered, "What love can't find harmony, if both people truly want it to." I believed that love was enough to find a balance, but I had forgotten that sometimes finding a balance means shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's mold. That evening I stood alone in the living room. My wedding dress was neatly hung over a chair. The light shone on the thin veil, creating a shimmering band of brilliance. I touched it, feeling the coldness, like touching a dream that was drawing to a close. Mark was in the next room talking to his mother on the phone. I heard his voice, low and gentle, and the repeated phrase, "Yes, Mom." The room was full of light, but I felt like I was standing on the edge, where the glow couldn't quite reach. I looked in the mirror, seeing the cold reflection stretching across my face. A part of me knew this light wouldn't be warm anymore, but I smiled anyway, like every bride who believes every beginning is beautiful. On the first morning in the Hart family home, sunlight pierced the curtains, casting golden stripes across the dark mahogany dining table. The air was faintly scented with lavender, soft yet somehow strained, as if carefully staged to imply perpetual perfection. On the table, the white porcelain cups were aligned precisely, the teaspoons set parallel, not an inch out of place. I gently touched the glossy tabletop, seeing my own reflection in it. A new wife, still believing love would make everything easier to breathe. The hard click of heels sounded from the hallway. Vivian appeared, dressed in white, her pearl necklace catching the light, her perfume carrying a hint of black tea. Her expression was serene, her eyes cool, as though scrutinizing every dust particle in the room. "Mark's tea at 8, brown sugar, 1 teaspoon. Her voice was even, light, but there was no "good morning." I stood up, giving a slight nod. Part of me wanted to say, "I know how to make my husband's tea." But I stayed silent, because in her look I understood. This was not a reminder, but the first command. She sat down, opening the newspaper. Everything was a long-established ritual, and I was merely a character, added without explanation. I poured the boiling water. The scent of Earl Grey drifted softly. In that warmth, I clearly saw the distance between the woman who had long governed this house and the one who had just entered it. I smiled, placed the teacup down, then said in a light, conversational tone, "If I wake up earlier, do you prefer coffee or tea?" Vivian looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. A silence, short but heavy. It wasn't defiance, I was simply setting the first boundary, with impeccable politeness. She folded the newspaper, a faint smile spreading, as if she had just spotted a minor scratch on a treasured antique. "I don't drink anything before 9, she replied, then opened a new page, her voice dry, devoid of emotion. I sat down, taking a sip of cool tea. In the stillness between the clock's ticking and the dissipating steam, I understood. This morning was not just the start of a new life. It was an audition between two women, each loving one man in two very different ways. The bedroom door opened. Mark appeared, his shirt half-buttoned, hair damp from the shower. He looked around, a flicker of discomfort crossing his eyes as he took in the two silent women. "She's always like this," he said, his voice low and slightly tired, as if the phrase had been repeated his entire life. I looked over. He avoided my gaze, then poured himself a cup of coffee. I noticed his movements, careful, navigating between two distinct currents in the air. The morning light highlighted the back of his neck, revealing a small truth I hadn't seen before. He was used to being unspoken. Vivian only smiled, her voice so gentle it was almost vacant. "My son just wants everything to be peaceful." I heard not love in that sentence, but ownership. I placed my spoon on the saucer, the sound small but deliberate. I smiled, my gaze steady. "I just want to meet the family standards." No one expected such a light sentence to carry such weight. Vivian froze. Her ramrod straight shoulders seemed to stiffen. She looked at me, and in that brief second I saw the pearls on her neck reflect the sunlight, sharp and cold. "Of course," she replied, her smile fading slowly, as if measuring the new boundary. I said nothing more. Silence was a clear enough answer. Mark looked at both of us, then sighed faintly. He didn't defend either, just pulled out his watch, the habit of a man afraid to be late, afraid to be wrong, afraid to disappoint anyone. I realized the man I loved lived in two versions of himself, one for his mother and one for me. The morning light streamed through the blinds, dividing the kitchen into two sections, warm gold and cold white. Vivian and I stood opposite each other, wordless, with only our breathing and the distance between us. Between us was the steaming teacup, the scent of Earl Grey, soft, but with a bitter aftertaste. She turned away first, ascending the stairs with her poise perfectly intact, proud and controlled. I remained seated, watching the stripe of sun fall across the tiled floor, slow and steady. For the first time, I understood that the glow can also make you blind, because it didn't come to warm, but to test how much truth you could withstand. The following days unfolded in a rhythm that was slow, immaculate, and entirely rule-bound. Vivian was like the high-ranking housekeeper of her own home, except she didn't just arrange objects, she arranged people. Every morning she instructed me on small tasks. The tablecloth must be folded this way so the creases don't show. Glasses must be washed in order, glass first, porcelain second. When calling Mark's friends, remember to say, "This is Elena Hart speaking. Don't forget the heart. It sounds more respectable." I stood by, listening, nodding, and smiling. But inside each word felt like a small incision cutting away at my freedom. She spoke to me as she would to a domestic employee who needed training. And I understood. What she wanted was not for me to know how to do things, but for me to do them her way. At lunch, the light glared off the highly polished silver cutlery. She continued to recount old stories about Mark. "He was always such a good boy. When he was little, all I had to do was look at him, and he knew what was expected." I smiled, placing my fork down so lightly it barely touched the table. In my mind, I thought, perhaps that's the problem. I listened, but I did not submit. In the evening, Mark returned late. He took off his tie, sighed, and sat down beside me. "Mom just means well," he said, his voice soft, as if apologizing on someone else's behalf. I looked at him, my smile slight. "No, she wants control." He looked up, momentarily stunned. "Elena," I waved a hand dismissively. "It's okay, I don't hate her. I just don't need someone to teach me how to breathe." He fell silent. Then, as always, he chose silence rather than taking a side. I grew accustomed to it. In this house, silence was the main language, and I was learning it every day. Night fell. I sat at the desk by the window opening my sketchbook. The lamplight fell on my hand holding the pencil, the lead thin, trembling slightly. I began to sketch the pearl-clad hand, the slender, stiff fingers resting on the teacup like a symbol of authority. I wasn't drawing her to mock her or to remember her. I was drawing to retain mental proof that control sometimes requires no shouting, only a look refined over years. When the sketch was complete, I closed the book. In the darkness reflected on the window pane, I saw myself, a person learning how to stand still amidst the rules of others, yet still keeping her own rhythm. That afternoon it was just Vivian and me in the kitchen. She stood by the window, the Earl Grey teacup in her hand, the steam thin as mist. Without Mark, the atmosphere seemed to contract, fragile but tense. She turned to me, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. A clever woman knows when to be silent. Her voice was even, smooth, like advice, but I heard the command within it, polished by years of authority. I looked straight at her, unwavering. I must be a very slow learner then. The sentence dropped into the space, light, but enough to change the color of the air. Vivian set the teacup down, gently turning her pearl necklace. In the light reflecting from the window glass, the pearls shimmered, round, beautiful, perfect, and hard. "Some things don't need to be said, Elena," she murmured. "I know," I replied. "But sometimes silence is also a form of complicity." She offered no response. She simply turned away, walking slowly out of the room, leaving behind the scent of black tea and a silence as dense as a thick wall. Night. The house was asleep, but I was awake. The porch light slipped through the curtains in thin slices, falling onto the wooden floor. In that quiet, I could hear her footsteps moving along the hallway, even, light, and precise, like the rhythm of someone checking that the world was still under control. The clock blended with my heartbeat, each beat soft, heavy, creating a kind of silent threat. No one said anything, but everything was being heard. I gently turned the desk lamp, the light falling on the open sketch pad. My pencil line from the afternoon had faded, leaving only the shadow of the pearl-clad hand. I closed the sketchbook, taking a long breath. I will learn how to win without screaming. No need to argue. No need to prove anything. Just stand firm, without bowing my head. Quiet as the light that still manages to pierce the thickest curtain. Outside, the wind sighed softly, carrying the scent of lavender mixed with the night air. I knew, from here on, the game would no longer be about politeness, but about patience and resilience, hidden beneath a layer of smiles. My first dinner party, hosting for the Hart family, felt like a performance, the only difference being that no one openly discussed their role. The table was dressed in white linen, candles flickered softly, and red wine shimmered in the glasses. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking, herb-crusted roast, blood-orange salad, and my mother's apple pie recipe. Vivian sat at the head of the table, in a cream-colored dress, the pearls still encircling her wrist, her fingers lightly resting on the wine glass. She smiled, polite, but her eyes monitored my every move. One of the guests had just complimented me. "Dinner is wonderful, Elena." She turned, her smile so gentle it was almost artificial. "The meat is slightly overdone, but that's fine. Mark prefers it tender." The space froze. Every clink of cutlery ceased. I put my fork down, lightly but distinctly. "Then next time you cook, I'll take notes." The sentence landed like a drop of red wine on the white cloth, small, but impossible to hide. Ethan, seated at the far end of the table, raised an eyebrow. Mark avoided eye contact, lifting his wine glass, pretending to focus on the background music. No one laughed. No one followed up. Only the wall clock ticked over one heavy beat, and then the entire room was immersed in a frozen atmosphere. I knew I had just struck a match against the polished veneer of this house. And like all fires, it began with a whisper of wine. When everyone had left, I cleared the table in silence. The smell of wine mixed with the extinguished candles, leaving a sharp sweetness in the air. Mark came over to help, but only gathered a few plates, then paused. "Lena, you don't have to, it's fine," I cut in, my voice calm. "I just want everything clean before bed." He was silent, not because he agreed, but because he didn't know what to say to the two women who had just battled with smiles. That night the house was utterly still. I sat in my study, the desk lamp casting light onto the wall, where patches of light and shadow overlapped, like breathing. From the living room, I could hear the metronome, the device Vivian used for her piano practice. The tick-tock was steady, perfect, never missing a beat. I closed my eyes. Each tick felt like an unwavering pulse of control, seeping through the house. Voiceover. I was being taught endurance, how to smile when criticized, how to breathe steadily in silence, and how to stay composed during a meal where every phrase was weighed like a sharp blade. I looked up into the window glass. My reflection was blurred, small, yet stubborn. And I knew, once the flame had caught, no one could pretend the light was as soft as it used to be. It was late. The house was so quiet, it felt as though all breath was suspended between the ceiling and the floor. I sat in my room, the light off, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway reflected in my eyes via the mirror. That light was just enough to clearly see my face, tired, but not defeated. I sat still, my breathing slow, even, and somewhat suppressed. The metronome downstairs continued, its steady beat like a constant reminder. In this house, no one is allowed to be wrong. I slowly folded my hands, feeling my fingertips cold as they touched the boundary of myself. Below, the distinct sound of a teacup being set down on a table. I could imagine Vivian sitting there, back straight, eyes distant, as if she were the only person who knew what was right. And I, the outsider, was learning how to inhale to someone else's rhythm. But in that exact moment I knew I wouldn't learn on their terms. I opened my sketchbook, the pencil trembling slightly in my hand. No more drawing pearl-clad hands. I began to sketch my own shadow. Straight, thin lines, imperfect, but real. When the final line closed, I put the pencil down and whispered, "I will learn, only to use it against them." I didn't speak with anger. I spoke as if making a note for a long-term plan. I understood that to survive in this house, I had to understand their rules, then use those very rules to unlock my own freedom. I would learn to make tea exactly as she liked, but choose the moment I poured it to force her to look at me. I would learn to speak softly, but ensure the final word was always mine. I would let them think I was weak, until they no longer noticed that I had become stronger in the silence. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes. The desk lamp flickered, reflected through the small mirror on the wall, casting a brief streak of light. From somewhere, the shadow of the pearls caught the light on the wall, shimmering like a warning. That light was no longer pure. It was sharp, cold, and carried the breath of a war that had not yet begun. I looked at it, unyielding, then quietly thought, "Fine, let's play." Outside the window, the wind whispered through the pine trees. The house was quiet, but within me the flame had truly caught. No longer a small spark, but the light I created for myself. After that dinner, Vivian escalated to subtler, more sophisticated tactics. No longer were they merely gentle reminders, but clever orchestrations. Touches that seemed harmless, but shifted everything by half an inch. My gallery appointment was subtly rescheduled. A partner invitation disappeared, only to reappear 3 days later in a kitchen drawer. The bouquet of white carnations I placed in the living room was clipped into individual sprigs, replaced by lavender, her preference. No one said a word. Nothing could be proven. But I understood. Each act was a message written in the language of authority. This is still my house. I noticed, but I did not react. Not out of fear, but because I wanted to see how far she would go. Sometimes, silence is the mirror that most clearly reflects a person's true nature. Thursday morning, I made the tea exactly at 8, as prescribed. Earl Grey, brown sugar. 1 teaspoon, no more, no less. I placed the cup gently in front of her, with a precision that bordered on mockery. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. Both of us smiled, the kind of smile full of knives, yet drawing no blood. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating 2 faces, one used to commanding, the other learning how not to submit. Vivian reached out to stir her tea, the spoon hitting the side of the cup with the distinct sound of a ticking clock. "Good," she said, her voice even. "You finally learned." I simply nodded. I'm always a fast learner, especially when the teacher is persistent. She paused for a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned, thin as thread. I drank my lukewarm coffee, the bitterness dissolving on my tongue, but inside, I was slowly finding my own rhythm. Mark walked in, his shirt slightly rumpled, his voice laced with sleepiness. "Don't provoke her, Elena." I turned, looking at him. My voice wasn't raised, but it was firm. "I'm just putting everything back in its rightful place, including respect." He sighed, grabbed a glass of water, avoiding both our gazes. "I just want peace." I smiled faintly and murmured, "Peace cannot be built on one person's silence." He didn't answer. He just stood there, caught between 2 lights, the sunlight shining on him while Vivian and I remained in the subtle shadows, where the quiet smelled of tea and calculation. I touched the wooden tabletop, feeling my heartbeat merge with the cool, smooth grain. This war had no sound, no bloodshed, only glances and teacups poured precisely every morning. But I knew, all silence comes with a price. In the days that followed, I learned a new skill, how to smile without bowing my head. It didn't come from arrogance, but from a survival instinct. When you live next to someone who needs control, you realize compliance is the most dangerous weapon. I still did everything as before, breakfast on time, the table tidy, the house scented with lavender, just as Vivian liked. But in every small gesture, I changed the rhythm, refusing to be led anymore. When she asked, "Have you called Mrs. Foster yet?" I replied, "Yes, I did, but I spoke with her husband, he handled it faster." Just one light sentence, yet enough to make her freeze. Each time I walked through the hallway, I still saw my reflection in the cabinet glass, blurred but clear enough to recognize that the woman inside was different. I no longer avoided the light, I turned it on myself, and saw in those eyes there was no longer fear, only a sharpened serenity. One afternoon I brought tea down to the garage where Ethan was adjusting his wooden boat model. Light slanted through the dusty window, casting silver streaks on his hair. He looked at me, asking nothing. He just watched me sit down, silent for a long moment. Finally he spoke. "You're playing her game by her rules." I shrugged. "I'm just learning how not to be consumed." Ethan offered a gentle smile, placing his hand on the wood surface, his voice low and sincere. "Hold firm, but don't stab. The moment you stab, you lose, because she will make you look like the culprit." I looked at him, nodding. In that moment I realized he was the only person in this house who clearly saw the war unfolding without needing to be told. I placed the warm teacup on his workbench and quietly said, "I'm not planning to stab anyone. I'm just planning to let the light shine through." Night. The house fell into quiet once more. I walked slowly through the hallway, where the family photos hung in straight lines. In each glass frame, the golden light reflected, distorted. I paused in front of my wedding photo with Mark. The smile in it looked strangely unfamiliar. I lightly touched the glass surface, my finger cold. I understood. Some battles are won only with composure, not by words, not by power, but by holding your breath steady when everything around you tries to choke it. I turned off the light, walked into the room, and in the darkness there was only a thin stripe of light piercing the curtain, like a crack, but the crack of truth. The afternoons in the Hart House always held a kind of pale, washed-out light, as if the sun itself were tired of having to shine through so many layers of glass. I descended to the basement, where the garage was separated from all the sounds above. The smell of old wood, machine oil, and the salt from the nearby bay mingled, heavy yet comforting, a genuine scent, unmasked. Ethan was seated at his workbench, sleeves rolled up, wiping a wooden ship model with the concentration of a man who doesn't need words to understand what is important. Light slanted from the dusty window, illuminating the small wooden parts, gleaming as if reflecting water. He heard me approach but did not turn around. "You're just in time," he said. "This mast almost broke. I'm trying to reattach it, not with glue, just with wire." I leaned against the wall, still holding my coffee cup. "Why?" "Because if the wind is strong, the wire allows it to lean but not break." I smiled. "A life philosophy." He nodded slightly. "In this house, you'll need it." A moment later, he set down his polishing cloth and turned to look at me. "You are strong, but here, strength must be subtle." I didn't react immediately. I just looked at the ship, at the small threads holding the mast steady against the fragile wooden hull. "I understand," I replied slowly. "You're not telling me to bow down. You're talking about survival." Ethan smiled, a smile half sympathy, half warning. "Exactly. Don't attack directly. She knows how to make every battle look like the other person's fault." I nodded. In the dim light, I clearly saw that he wasn't an outsider. He simply chose silence to maintain balance. Perhaps he had also lost this game once, the difference being that he knew when to stop. "Do you think I'll be able to endure it?" I asked. He wiped the wood again, saying softly, "You don't need to endure. Just stand still longer than they expect." After that afternoon, I began to observe. Not just Vivian, but Mark, the entire house. I track the behavior, the habits, the rhythm of each person, like a piece of music that repeats regularly but has a few dissonant notes. 7 a.m., Vivian walking through the hall, her hand touching the old photo frame. 7:10, Mark receiving a work email, never looking up when she walks in. 7:55, the sound of boiling water, the spoon hitting the cup. 9 a.m., silence. Always a void, as if the house were holding its breath. I noted it all mentally, every small detail. It felt as though they were characters in a painting of control. Vivian, the artist, Mark, the subject, Ethan, the observer, and I, the stray who walked into the frame uninvited. But I was beginning to understand the structure of that painting, every layer of color, every brushstroke. And one day, I would be the one holding the brush. In the days that followed, the distance between Mark and me lengthened with every meal. Not by arguments or cold words, but by silence. A silence that had shape, thick as the glass separating two people looking at the same view. He didn't look at me while eating. His eyes were glued to his phone or the newspaper, sometimes staring at some point behind me. I realized I had stopped seeking his gaze. Some things, when they have to be asked for too many times, even love wears thin. Like the edge of a dish towel, soft, but gradually tearing. In the evening we sat opposite each other, the gentle, steady sound of cutlery hitting the plates. He asked, What are you planning to do tomorrow? Maybe walk around the bay, do some sketching. Just one word, then silence. I bit my lip gently, feeling an entire empty room between us, which neither of us bothered to clean up. The next morning, I opened the window. A thin strip of sunlight streamed through the curtain, falling onto the floor like golden threads searching for a path. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. In this house, everything had rules, even the light, but there was still a way for it to sneak through. I sighed softly, saying to myself, "No one can lock up the sun." The sentence came out naturally, like a breath, like a reminder that I still had freedom somewhere. I didn't want to win. I just didn't want to turn into someone else. Even living within the frame she built, I was still myself. Someone who could find the path of the light, even if it was just a small sliver. In the afternoon, I cleaned the window glass. Old dust streaks mixed with fingerprints lingered from the early days of my arrival. I wiped slowly, from top to bottom, until the haze disappeared. Outside, the late afternoon sun shone through, casting a warm golden glow onto the window frame. I paused, lifting my head. In the crystal clear glass, I saw my own clear reflection, no longer blurred as before. A slightly thinner face, calm eyes, skin catching the light. I stood there, still holding the wet cloth, feeling as though I had washed away not just the dust on the glass, but the mist in my own heart. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly present in this house. Not as someone allowed to stay, but as someone who chose to stay, to understand it. Outside, the sound of the bay waves gently lapped. The wind carried the scent of salt mixed with the lavender from the garden. The light reflected in my eyes, warm, small, and resolute. That evening, the wind from the bay blew colder than usual. I was clearing my drawing table when Ethan appeared, holding a double-folded brown envelope, its edges worn. He said nothing, simply placing it in my hand. "She controls all the accounts, even Mark's salary." His voice was low and hoarse, as if afraid the house itself might overhear. I held the envelope, smelling the dry paper and old dust. The documents, statements, signatures, expenses, were neatly aligned, meticulous lines, frighteningly clean. All my life I had believed tidiness was a sign of decency. Now I understood. Sometimes, it's how people cover their tracks. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, the hallway light hitting his face diagonally. "I shouldn't show you this, but if I didn't, you'd never understand why everything in this house is always fine. It's fine because she wills it to be." I looked up. "And you?" "I chose silence, but you are different." I nodded. To my surprise, my heart held no anger, only a cold sensation, deep and slow, like water seeping into cracks. I opened the envelope, reading page after page. Mark's salary, transferred directly into his mother's joint account. Investments, property, even the car we drove, all in Vivian's name. I could hear my blood pulsing in my ears, yet when I spoke, my voice remained calm. "So this is her kind of love." Ethan looked up, meeting my eyes, but didn't intervene. I continued, my voice lower. "Control. Like the way someone strokes their child's hair. They think they're nurturing them, but really, they're just making sure they can't wander off." I folded the papers, stacking them neatly, then looked out the window. It was completely dark, only the streetlights reflected in the glass, casting the shadows of Ethan and me. Two people sharing the silence of those who know more than they wish to. When I walked into the room, Mark was sitting in his chair, laptop open, the blue light reflecting off his tired face. I placed the envelope on the desk. He glanced at it, then avoided my gaze. "Did you find something?" "No. Just a few figures concerning your accounts." He hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the chair. "I don't want to talk about this." I stayed silent. I didn't question, didn't pressure, but pulled my sketchbook from the drawer. Under the lamplight, I copied the numbers with my pencil, small, even, precise lines. Not to accuse, but to remember. I closed the book, my hand resting on the soft leather cover. Outside, the wind gently tapped against the window. In the silent house, I could distinctly hear the clock, each beat, slow, patient, like the rhythm of a secret waiting to be exposed. I sat alone in my study. The room held only the small desk lamp, the light slanting onto the edge of the sketchbook, reflected back through the window pane in front of me. Outside, the sky was a thin gray, like wet cloth, the moon half obscured. I tilted my head slightly, watching the light reflect on my face, cold and clear. It was no longer soft like the early days, no longer the honey color of trust, but transparent, sharp as glass. I realized I had changed, no longer afraid of the light, but using it to illuminate. Mark was still in the next room, the keyboard sound steady, each click slicing the air. We spoke less, but this silence wasn't like the previous ones. It wasn't avoidance, it was the interval, waiting for the inevitable. My hand rested on the closed envelope. The paper was thin, but heavy. Every number, every line of text inside, was like a thread binding the people in this house to the same secret. I knew the moment for confrontation had arrived. There was no retreating, no ignoring it, because one more day of silence meant accepting life within a lie. I went down the stairs. The sound of my heels echoed softly, blending with the clock's chime in the living room. Vivian was sitting there, bathed in the warm yellow light, holding her teacup as if nothing could disturb her composure. On the table, the family photos were neatly arranged, the glass reflecting smiling faces. I stopped at the last step. She looked up. "It's late, Elena." "I know." I pulled a chair, sitting directly opposite her. On the table, the envelope lay between us. Neither of us spoke. In the golden light, her eyes were brighter than usual. She didn't look at the envelope. She looked straight at me, as if she had already anticipated my purpose. The silence was absolute. I could hear the faint sound of tea dripping onto the ceramic tray. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch, letting the light shine brightly enough onto the center of the table, illuminating every tiny dust particle floating in the air. Then I spoke, slowly, as if cutting each word from my chest. "Do you really think you can hold everything in the palm of your hand forever?" Vivian tilted her head, her smile thin as a razor blade. "We only keep what others are too afraid to take back." I didn't respond. The light from the window shone directly between us, splitting the room into two halves, one dark, one bright. I sat in that illuminated half, and for a moment, I saw her face clearly, every wrinkle, every faint tremor around the corner of her lips. The power was gone. Only the fear of someone seeing her true self remained. I understood. When the light is strong enough, no shadow can hide. The house was silent. The clock ticked again, steady and dry. I closed the envelope, needing to say nothing more. On the wall, the shadows of the two women overlapped, then separated, like two melodies no longer sharing a rhythm. Outside the door, the wind blew, carrying the dampness of the bay, the scent of salt, and the scent of freedom. I turned and walked up the stairs, and for the first time in months, my shoulders felt light. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped being afraid of knowing the truth. The next morning, the air in the house was thick, like sea mist. I woke up earlier than usual, prepared coffee, and set the dining table as always, but my heart was strangely quiet. Every movement of my hands was slow and deliberate, as if I was conserving every breath for the moment that was to come. Vivian appeared precisely at 8. Cream dress, the pearls still luminous, hair neatly pinned. She looked no different from any morning before, except for a momentary glance when she saw me already seated at the table, the brown envelope lying neatly in the center, between us. I pulled out a chair, inviting her to sit. "Would you like to explain?" The sound of the question was soft, yet I knew it was enough to make the room halt. The morning light streamed through the window, casting a long stripe of brilliance across the table. She touched the tip of her fingers to the envelope, not opening it, just tilting her head to look at me, her pale gray eyes slightly narrowed. "You are being disruptive, Elena," she said, her voice even, clear, and perfectly steady. "In this house, everything functions well because there is order. You are new here. You shouldn't stir up what you don't understand." I met her gaze, unwavering, and replied softly, "I know how to count." For a second, the smile on her lips stalled, like a piece of music dragged off key. I pushed the envelope toward her. My hand did not shake. "Mark's salary, his accounts, even his investments, all are under your name. I understand the order you speak of. The only difference is that it's not balance, it's control." Vivian leaned back in her chair, her hand resting on her pearls. "You don't understand this world, Elena. No one stands firm without someone steering the ship. Mark doesn't know how to manage, I am merely helping." I pressed my lips together. To help is to grant opportunity, not to take it away. "Did you ever teach your son about freedom?" She let out a brittle laugh, thin as shattering crystal. "Freedom is what the weak cite when they are not strong enough to lead." I didn't reply. That sentence needed no rebuttal. It spoke the truth of itself. Mark came down the stairs, his shirt still unbuttoned, his eyes clouded with lingering sleep. He paused when he saw the two women facing each other. The room bright, yet the air cold as glass. "What is going on?" I looked at him, not with accusation, but simply pointing to the envelope. "How long have you known about this?" He went silent, his eyes flickering between me and his mother. In that brief moment I saw his gaze break, as if a part of him had just realized something irreparable. "I didn't." He stopped, then looked over at Vivian, searching for words. "Mother, was this necessary?" Vivian turned her head, her voice low. "Mark, don't let an outsider complicate our family matters." That sentence struck me, not as an attack, but as a final declaration. I had never truly belonged here. At the end of the table, Ethan quietly walked in, his coffee cup still in hand. He remained silent, only giving a slight supportive nod in my direction, his gaze clear and calm. That nod needed no words. It was the acknowledgement that, finally, someone in this house saw what I saw. I remained seated, my hands clasped, listening to the clock tick. No one spoke further. Outside, the early light slipped through the curtain, cutting across the space, like an irreversible dividing line. No one knows who pushed back their chair first, only the slight scrape of the chair leg on the wooden floor. The window burst open. The wind from the bay rushed in, snapping the curtain violently like a prolonged sigh held too long by the house. The cold air flooded in. The teacup on the table tipped over, the warm liquid spilling out like a blurred memory being erased. The light poured in, cold, yet beautiful. It settled on everything. On Mark's pale face, on Vivian's hand clutching the string of pearls, on the dark brown envelope in the center of the table, now stained with tea. I remained seated, unmoving, just watching that light. The light that had traveled through so many layers of curtains, so many seasons, just to arrive here. Vivian stood up, her chair crashing backward. "You have ruined this family." Her voice was high, fractured, hitting the wooden ceiling and falling down like breaking glass. I inhaled deeply, then whispered, "No, I just cleaned it up." The sentence slipped out soft as a breath, yet in that softness was a power even I hadn't expected. Not anger, not hatred, just the truth. And the truth always has its own volume. Vivian looked at me, silent for several long seconds. Then she turned away, her shoulders smaller than I thought. Mark stood frozen, moving towards neither of us. He looked at his mother, then at me, his eyes empty, like someone lost between two shores. Ethan remained in the corner, his eyes calm, neither saving nor judging. Another gust of wind blew in. The scent of lavender, tea, and the salt from the sea mingled, filling the room. The wedding photo of Mark and me fell from the shelf, shattering on the floor. No one moved to pick it up. I looked at the shards of glass, seeing the light reflected back on my face. Clear, still, no longer trembling. In that brokenness I saw no disaster. I saw a beginning. No one said anything more. No hissing, no justification. Only the steady tick of the clock in the middle of the room. The familiar rhythm of the house, now strangely alien. I pushed away from the table, walking towards the porch, where the morning sun was high. Behind me the house still stood, silent, but no longer whole. I knew that what had dissolved was not the roof tiles, not the walls, but the invisible thread that had once bound everyone in the illusion called peace. And as I walked out I felt lighter, as if finally the wind had cleared all the old air from within me. The day Mark left, the sky was a heavy, dense gray, like a freshly painted wall that hadn't dried. He didn't say much, only packing a few personal items into an old black suitcase. The room echoed with the cold, smooth sound of the zipper, exactly like a marriage being neatly folded, without leaving any emotion outside. I didn't try to stop him, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood. If I had to hold him with pleas, what I would gain was only the hollow shell of a love that had been eroded. Ethan stood at the door, offering no intervention. As Mark closed the car trunk, he said just one sentence, his voice soft. "Just let it be, Elle." I nodded. Ethan helped clean up the remaining items, the photo frame, the cups and saucers, and the old chair with the broken leg that no one had ever bothered to fix. When the door closed, I stood in the middle of the empty house, silent, as if all sound had been sucked out. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through my skin, creeping up to my shoulders. I crossed my arms, not to keep warm, but to feel the distinct emptiness I had just walked into. No more kettle whistling. No more sounds of Vivian arranging everything. No more Mark with his short, steady breaths every morning. Only the smell of old wood and the pale light from the window. A light that looked alien in a house once so bright from too much pretending. I sat down on a chair, my hands resting on the bare tabletop. Everything around was painfully clean. In that cleanliness, there was a kind of ruin that only those who have lived under absolute control understand. Petrified exhaustion. I smiled faintly. Not a large smile, just a breathless note in the old room. Victory sometimes comes without celebration, without fireworks, without even a glance of acknowledgement. Only the quiet residue of fatigue and the lighter breath that comes from knowing you've walked through a door with nothing left to hold you back. I looked up at the white wall in front, where the wedding photo used to hang. Now, only the empty nail remained, the paint around it slightly paler, framing a loss. The light slanted through the window, reflecting on the nail head, glittering like a metallic teardrop. I touched it, feeling the sharp coldness. There was no photo left to cover it, and no reason to put one back. Only me in the blank space, straight, raw, and true. Behind me, Ethan closed the living room door. He didn't speak, just looked around as if cleaning a house after a storm. I knew everything would have to be rebuilt, but not today. Today I needed to stand still. Amidst the rubble, the cold air, the quietness of a life just shed. I stood up, looking around the house one last time. Everything was neatly packed, too neat, devoid of human presence. On the table, the coffee I made that morning was still there, completely cold, the surface flat as a small mirror. I walked to the corner where my easel leaned against the wall. Old paint streaks dried on the wooden frame, the scent of oil faintly lingering in the air, the only scent that still belonged to me. I picked up the easel, my hand gripping the cold wood, and headed for the door. No need to pack anything else. No pictures, no mementos, no goodbyes. I knew that if I looked back even once, I would break. Not out of regret, but because I would be pulled back into what was once called home. And I could not return there, to a place where every ray of light had to ask permission to shine. I opened the door. A gust of wind rushed in, carrying the damp air and the smell of earth. The house behind remained silent, as if holding its last breath before I vanished from it. I didn't slam the door, just closed it softly, letting the latch fall with a definitive sound. Outside, a light rain was falling. The first drops of the season hit the car window, small, sharp sounds, like a drumbeat, signaling a new beginning. I put the easel in the trunk, got into the driver's seat, my hands still damp, and watched the wipers clear the glass in front of me. The town was the same, quiet, the smell of baking bread from the corner cafe, the distant church bell. But everything seemed to be viewed through a new pane of glass, clearer, colder, more honest. I rolled down the window, letting the rain spray my face. It didn't hurt, it was just cool. A strange, clean feeling, as if all the dust in my heart was being washed away, too. The red light turned on, and I stopped. In that moment, I realized I wasn't fleeing. I was leaving. As the car turned off the road leading to the bay, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house faded, then disappeared completely behind the veil of rain. I didn't cry. Tears were once what I feared, but today, I no longer needed them to validate my sorrow. I left there, alone, but truly myself. No one would define me by a role, no one would call my name with pity. I was the one who had lost everything they deemed important, and because of it, I finally regained myself. The rain continued to fall, shimmering on the car glass. In the distance, the sky was gradually lightening, faint, but enough to see the new road ahead. I took a long breath. For the first time in years, that breath was borrowed from no one. The apartment I rented in the small outer borough was just wide enough to turn between two light-colored walls. It was small, but filled with sun. The light poured in from a large window overlooking the bay. In the morning, it felt as though someone had opened another door within my soul. I had bought nothing but a wooden table, a slender chair, and the old coffee mug I brought from the Hart House. Everything was so bare that every step echoed, yet there were no other footsteps but my own, and that, strangely, was what made the room comfortable. I made coffee. The bitter aroma spread with the warmth. The smell reminded me of mornings in Portland when I was studying art, days filled only with color, light, and the aspiration to see the world through my own eyes. But now, I spent that first morning sitting blankly by the window, watching the specks of light dance on the wooden floor. The sound of the waves echoed from afar, soft and steady, like the breath I was learning to reclaim. I didn't think about Mark or Vivian, nor did I think about the confrontation or the documents still lying somewhere in my canvas bag. I just sat, watching the light change color with the hour, from pale white to golden, then turning amber as noon approached. In that quietude, a question arose in my mind, slow and clear as a stranger's voice. I won. But am I happy? I didn't have an answer. I only felt light, but empty. Perhaps freedom doesn't bring immediate joy, but the space needed to learn to breathe again after being suffocated for too long. As afternoon settled, the sun's angle forced me to stand up. The room was too quiet, so quiet that I feared I would dissolve into it if I sat any longer. I opened a small box placed in the corner, taking out my old paint set and sketchbook. The tubes of paint were half dry. The smell of oil was still potent. I squeezed hard. A few drops of paint fell onto the palette, red, blue, yellow, colors that had been forgotten. I began to paint again. Not for anyone, not for exhibition. Just to remember that my hands still knew how to tremble when faced with the light. The brushstroke started shaky, but then grew firmer. Each swipe of color was like a heartbeat reconnecting. I didn't paint people. I didn't paint houses. I only painted the light falling on the wooden floor, free, raw, and true. For the first time in a long while, I felt the room brighten not just because of the sun, but because I was in it, living. That afternoon, while I was absent-mindedly working on a patch of light on the canvas, there was a knock at the door. The rhythm was light, steady, the kind of person who didn't want to interrupt someone else's quiet. I opened the door to find Ethan standing there, holding 2 steaming coffee cups. The sunlight slanted across his shoulder, golden as honey. "I know you hate unannounced visitors," he said, his voice laced with a smile. "Good. At least you remember that much about me." I tilted my head, inviting him in. The small apartment had no spare chairs. He placed a coffee cup on the drawing table, leaning against the wall, observing the still wet canvas. A long silence passed, broken only by the sound of my pencil tapping lightly against the table edge. Then he spoke. "You changed them." I stopped, looked up and smiled faintly. "No. I just stopped letting them change me." The sentence came out without thought. It wasn't a proclamation, but a truth that had been washed clean by the storm. Ethan was silent, only looking at me. A gaze without pity, without praise. He understood. We sat quietly, drinking coffee, listening to the wind slip through the door crack. In that moment, no one spoke of the past, or those who had left. All that remained were 2 people, standing in the slanted light of late afternoon, knowing that everything was different. On the table, the pencil resumed scratching against the paper, the small, steady sound like the room's own breathing. I leaned forward, sketching the line where the light met the water. Every stroke across the paper left a mark like a pulse, stable, slow, and alive. The sunlight sparkled on the window glass, scattering specks of light onto the canvas like glitter. I paused, watching the light run silently and naturally along the glass. No more control. No more framework to maintain. Only warmth, a heartbeat, and me. I understood that freedom is not loud. It is not a shout or a declaration. It is the ability to sit peacefully in your own room without fear. Outside, the sky had turned a pale yellow, thin and warm like an old woolen blanket. The scent of cool coffee lingered in the air. I leaned my head against the back of the chair, watching the light paint the final contours of the afternoon. There was nothing spectacular, no laughter or tears, only a long, gentle, and honest breath of peace. I quietly closed my sketchbook, my heart as still as the water outside the bay. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was trying to live right. I was simply living. I was putting away my palette when the phone rang. A long, slow, unfamiliar ring. A sound I thought I would never hear again. On the screen was a name I had not expected. Vivian Hart. I considered letting it ring until it stopped, but then I answered. Her voice was faintly shaky, like someone who had held their silence for too long. "Elena, I'm sorry. I was more afraid of losing him than I was capable of loving him." The sentence fell into my ear, quiet, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime spent not knowing how to love. On the other end, her breathing was fractured. Perhaps she was ill, or perhaps simply weakened, now that power could no longer sustain her. I stayed silent, not out of anger, but because I didn't know what to say. In the small apartment, the afternoon light slanted onto the floor, long and fragile. I placed the phone on the table, watching it light up and then go dark, as if monitoring the final breath of something old. That night I didn't sleep. I hesitated for hours, torn between resentment and compassion. On the table, the small lamp flickered, as if undecided whether to turn off or stay on. I sat behind the wheel, the engine running, the windows fogged with my breath. Outside the mist hung thin, the pale yellow streetlights reflecting on the glass. I put my hands on the steering wheel, my heart heavy. To go or not to go? That wasn't a question about her. It was about me. If I went, was I returning to my old shackles? If I stayed, was I running from my own conscience? The clock ticked over minute by minute. Rain began to fall softly, tracing long streaks down the car window, like thoughts I hadn't yet wiped away. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, hearing her voice echo in my mind. I was more afraid of losing him than I was capable of loving him. That sentence, strangely, no longer made me angry. It only made me sad. A pristine sadness that comes when you see the person who hurt you is now left with nothing but fear. I turned off the car. I stayed put, letting my emotions settle. Early the next morning, before the sky had completely changed color, I drove back to the old house. I wasn't sure why. Perhaps I wanted a visible finality, or simply didn't want to carry that single sentence with me for the rest of my life. The gate was open, just as it had been the day I left. The gravel driveway smelled of damp earth. I stopped the car at the porch, stepped out, and the first sensation that struck me was the silence. No more clock chiming, no more kettle whistling, no more human presence in the air. The old house was silent now, the scent of antiseptic mixing with old lavender. I realized I was standing at the junction of two smells, a life fading and memories lingering. I inhaled deeply, slowly, and walked forward. Each step echoed on the floorboards, like a soft tap on the door of time, old, but not completely closed. I entered the room. The door was ajar, weak light filtering through the thin curtains. Vivian lay in bed, her body thin, her face pale. But her eyes were still bright, still holding the gaze that had made me look away countless times. The only difference was that today, there was no power in that look, only a mother who did not know how to love. I approached her, saying nothing. She took my hand. Her grip was cold and dry, yet tight, as if afraid I would vanish. I did not know how to be a mother. Her voice was broken, small, hoarse like crumpled paper. I sat down on the edge of the bed, looking at those hands, the hands that had controlled everything in that house, that had held the power to decide others' fates, now trembling like the last leaf on a branch. I felt no triumph, no pity, just peace. No one taught me how to be human, but I still learned. I spoke softly, neither with emphasis nor gentleness. She closed her eyes. Tears leaked out, rolling slowly down her cheek. I didn't wipe them, just let them fall, the way everything in her life should have been let go naturally. Better late than never. Outside, the wind whispered through the porch. The half-open window tapped against the wall, creating a steady, rhythmic sound, like a lullaby. I stood up, replaced the blanket over her shoulders, and smoothed the pillow. Vivian sighed faintly, drifting into sleep. I sat quietly for a while longer, only listening to the clock in the corner. The sound that once felt suffocating now became ordinary. Perhaps because everything had finally been spoken, even if late. What remained between us was neither love nor hate. It was understanding, fragile, but real. When I walked out onto the porch, darkness had fallen. The light outside the door was weak, pale yellow, flickering in the wind, but enough to light the way home. I stood looking at the stone path leading to the bay, the mist thin, the light bleeding onto the damp ground. I knew no one would stay in this house much longer, but that no longer saddened me, because some houses exist only to teach us how to leave, and some people only appear to teach us how to let go. I turned my back, taking a deep breath. The air was cold but light,
My shadow stretched long across the porch, merging with that faint light. Enough to return, enough not to get lost. And I walked away, no longer afraid.
I returned to the house the following day, not out of obligation, but for something lighter. A quiet certainty had settled in my heart. The kitchen, once a place that filled me with dread, now held only the mundane sounds of the chopping board and the boiling water. I prepared a simple dinner, a pot of chicken soup, some bread, a few apple slices placed neatly on a white plate. It was nothing elaborate, not a meal of reconciliation, but simply dinner between two people who had survived the same storm. The sound of the knife hitting the board was light and steady, echoing faintly in the large house. The aroma of sautéed onions, soup, and a hint of kitchen smoke drifted out, mixing with the old lavender scent on the curtain. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, cautious. Vivian stood at the threshold, a gray cardigan draped over her shoulders, her gray hair slightly disheveled. She said nothing, just watched me ladle soup into a bowl. I offered, "Have some. The soup is still warm." She sat down. Her hands were thin, the knuckles prominent. For the first time, I realized that time had taken more from her than I had ever imagined. We ate, not looking at each other, only listening to the sound of spoons hitting the ceramic bowls. After a while, Vivian ate slowly, then spoke quietly. "Thank you." Just 2 words, soft, brief. But strangely, they no longer carried the weight of a command. I looked up, meeting her eyes. They were no longer icy, just tired. I replied, "There's no debt. It's just dinner." She nodded softly, as if she understood. No one spoke further. But in that silence, something was returned to its rightful place. There were no more battle lines. No one had to win. Only 2 women. One who had tried to hold on to everything, and one who had learned how to let go. The room was quiet, bathed in the warm golden light of the lamp which softened everything. The light shone on the faces of the 2 former adversaries, creating soft lines, sparkling on the skin like an errant light caught between 2 eras, the past and the present. I looked around. The table was still there, the chair still creaked slightly when moved, the curtain still swayed in the breeze, but the room was no longer heavy. The light somehow had softened the memory. No need for further apologies, no need for explicit forgiveness. Just sitting together in a small space, listening to the breathing and the scent of soup mingling with the night. That was enough to understand that what once hurt us can also become the place where we reclaim our humanity. The meal ended in silence, unforced, without any bitter aftertaste. Only the clock ticking time and the sound of the wind slipping past the doorframe remained. I stood up, putting on my coat. Vivian was still sitting there, her hand resting lightly on the table, her eyes watching me, not scrutinizing, but as if fearing this moment would pass too quickly. As my hand touched the doorknob, her voice came, soft as a breath. "Keep warm." Just 2 words, but for the first time, they did not carry the tone of a command. No more must, no more should, no more calculated arrangement in every word. Just a simple, clumsy, and late worry, like the final ray of sunlight still finding its way through a closed window. I turned back, looking at her for a moment. She sat in the yellow light, her shadow long on the wall. The image of the woman who controlled everything was gone, leaving only a small figure, silent amidst the slowly spreading warmth of the kitchen. I nodded softly. "I will." Then I smiled and left. The door closed behind me without a loud sound, just a soft click, like a goodbye spoken just loud enough. Outside, the wind was gentler. The trees along the road swayed slightly, the streetlights reflecting off the puddles in undulating streaks of light. I walked slowly, my hands tucked into my pockets, the chill hitting my face, cool, real, and comforting. Every step was light, not because I had forgotten the past, but because I had stopped carrying it. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't start with saying, "I forgive you," but with the moment we no longer wish to carry the pain itself. I looked up at the pale sky, a few weak stars piercing through the clouds. Within me there was a new silence, a quiet that didn't come from loss but from understanding. Forgiveness doesn't need words. It just needs peace. I continued walking, leaving the yellow light and the warm kitchen behind, carrying a faint trace of soup on my sweater, a small aroma that I knew, for the rest of my life, I would never forget. Spring arrived earlier than I expected. On the bay, the fog lifted quickly, and the morning light streamed through the window, hitting the wooden table where I stretched a new canvas. I had just opened my small class. Boundaries and brushes. No fancy sign, just a handwritten placard hung outside the studio. Learn to draw, learn to breathe. 6 women sat around the table, each with her own story, a pair of hands that had trembled from loss, from hurt, or from simply forgetting how to hold a brush. They sat there, hands shaking as they held the brush, trying to keep the colors from bleeding, to keep the lines from collapsing. I looked at them, recognizing in those tentative strokes a deep courage, the courage of those who had once had to ask permission just to exist. I walked around, my voice soft. It's okay. Here, no one needs to paint beautifully. You just need to paint honestly. One woman looked up. But I don't know where to start. I replied. Start where it hurts the most. Put the color there. She smiled, and the first stroke touched the paper. In the second class, when the atmosphere was less hesitant, I spoke to them, slowly and clearly. No one teaches you how to love. They only teach you how to fear. The sentence came out like a long exhalation. I wasn't trying to preach, just stating something I wish I had been told. The room fell quiet. No sound of brushes, no moving chairs. Just the birds outside and the smell of fresh paint mingling with the breeze. An older woman looked down at the table, her shoulders trembling slightly. I didn't touch her, just stood beside her, giving them the space they needed to find their own breath. I remembered my own past self, sitting in a house full of rules, trembling just like that, also afraid of loving the wrong way. And I knew, from this silence, something was being loosened, if only a little. At the end of the session, Ethan arrived. He often stopped by unannounced, carrying his camera and the familiar smell of coffee. He didn't say much, just quietly took a few photos as the light poured through the window, illuminating the table where hands were painting. The flash reflected brightly off the glass for a second, then vanished. I turned to him, seeing him smile, nodding slightly, as if to say, "You are exactly where you belong." I smiled back. Not a smile to prove anything, but the kind of smile you make when you realize you have finally escaped the frame that once held you in silence. When everyone had left, I stayed alone in the room. The window was still open, the salty wind from the bay carrying the scent of oil paint, coffee, and the faint echo of recent laughter. I tidied the table, washed the brushes, and then involuntarily looked up at the window glass in front of me. In the layer of afternoon light, I saw my own reflection smiling. A genuine smile. That smile wasn't trying to hide anything, nor was it the polite kind I had practiced at the Hart house parties. It came naturally, light as a breath, and it lingered. I watched for a long time, as if wanting to engrave the image. The woman once confined by obedience, now smiling in her own light. Ethan called out from the doorway, "That's beautiful." "The mirror?" I asked, half-jokingly. "No," he said. "The person in it." I turned just quickly enough to see him raise his camera. The click was crisp and small, but in my heart, the sound was like a punctuation mark. An end to the old chapter, a beginning to the new. The next morning I arrived at the studio earlier than usual. The room was flooded with pale golden light, streaming through the window and settling on the paintings hung around the walls. The initial rough strokes were now dry. The colors overlapped, clumsy but full of meaning. Each painting was a fragment of life. A woman learning how to smile again, how to cook a meal just for herself, how not to apologize for wanting silence. I walked along the wall, my finger lightly tracing the dry paint. No longer afraid to get my hands dirty, no longer afraid to be wrong. The light followed my movements, dancing on the glass, a reminder that freedom had always been here, just waiting for me to open the door. I pulled back the curtains, letting the sunlight flood in. The room lit up, everything becoming so clear it was almost transparent. I sat down in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and knew. Finally, I was truly free. No longer needing validation, no longer wanting to be understood. I only needed to be myself, the woman who still believed in the light, despite having been consumed by the dark. Freedom does not arrive with applause, nor is it the moment we walk away from someone. It arrives when we sit alone in our small room, watching the sun change color, and are no longer afraid. I opened my sketchbook and drew another line of light across the white page. A thin golden streak, enough to remember. I had stepped out of someone else's frame and begun to paint my life with my own hands. That morning, a beige envelope lay on my desk. No sender, no stamp. Just a familiar line written in blue ink. Elena. I opened it. The paper folded once, Mark's handwriting, still neat, cautious, exactly the way he always lived. I left that house. I understand now that love doesn't require anyone's permission. Just one sentence, but it landed like a heavy exhale upon my memory. I read it. I didn't cry. I only stayed quiet. Not because I was empty of feeling, but because the time had come when my heart no longer needed tears to confirm that it had once been in pain. I placed the letter back on the desk, where the morning light shone onto it. The paper was slightly curved, reflecting the sunlight like a small streak trying to reconnect something that had been broken. I lightly touched his handwriting, not to remember, but to acknowledge that, even after everything, something true had remained. 3 weeks later, Mark appeared. No flowers, no gifts, and no apologies. He stood at the studio doorway, tall, his hair slightly messy, his face thinner, his eyes holding the same look I had always known, a certain awkwardness beneath the composure. I was wiping my palette when he finally spoke. I'm not asking to come back. I just wanted to see you happy. The statement was so simple it required no immediate answer. I put the brush down, looked up, letting the light from the frame shine horizontally between us. Mark looked like someone who had learned to live again, no longer bearing the posture of a man torn between his mother and his wife. I saw in his eyes not regret, but understanding, late but genuine. He looked around the room, where my paintings hung along the walls. Images of a hand holding a brush, reflected light, and the silent faces of women. He smiled faintly. You really turned the pain into light. I replied, soft as the wind. Pain is also just color. We just hadn't learned how to mix it. I poured 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of him. Still like peppermint tea? Still do, he replied, his voice husky. But now I know how to make it myself. We both laughed. Not the laughter of people still in love, but of 2 individuals who had endured the same storm and were grateful to have survived. I looked at him for a long time, then said, If you came to repaint things together, come in. The small room, the sunlight settling on the floor, on my hands that were now less shaky. Mark crossed the threshold, slowly, like someone afraid of shattering the existing peace. No new beginning is truly easy, but perhaps this time, no one needed permission to love or to forgive. That evening, the wind from the bay was soft and damp. I chose a small spot by the water, a place that used to have a weekend jazz band, where the yellow light spilled onto the walls, bleeding into patches like unfinished paint. When I arrived, Mark was already seated. He poured red wine. The aroma of ripe fruit mixed with oak spread, rich yet mellow. We didn't speak right away. I looked out the window, seeing shadows of people moving on the water's surface, flickering like memories. The song Autumn in New York played from the corner, the long, warm, lonely note of the saxophone lingering. Mark set his wine glass down, his voice low. I left the house, Elena. For the first time, I lived a day without hearing my mother's voice, without anyone asking, "What are you going to do with your life?" I cooked, I cleaned, I paid the electric bill myself. It seems small, but it felt like genuine breathing. I nodded gently, listening without interrupting. The things he described, they were what I had once hoped for, waited for, and resented him for not doing. Hearing them now, they were just late pieces, no longer causing me pain. He smiled, gently clinking his glass against mine. You know what? It turns out freedom doesn't mean being away from someone, but stopping what you no longer believe in. We drank together. The taste of wine slid down my throat, warming me to the chest. After a moment, he leaned in and asked, quietly, but clearly audible above the rain outside the porch, "Can we start over with a different song?" I looked at him, seeing eyes that no longer pleaded, no longer feared. Only the gaze of someone who had experienced enough. Enough to know that love was no longer a binding, but a choice to face the light together. I didn't answer. I just tilted my head, letting the yellow light fall onto the 2 wine glasses, merging into a soft, blurred amber like a sunset pouring onto water. The music changed to Blue Moon. We sat quietly until the last note faded, leaving only the steady sound of rain outside the door. On the way home, the rain still hadn't stopped. The drops fell fine on the car window, a gentle rhythm like someone tapping on a memory. The city was quiet, only the red lights bleeding onto the wet pavement. I turned my head to look at Mark, his face reflected in the porch light, a streak of light cutting across the bridge of his nose, making his eyes strangely softer. Neither of us spoke, but amidst the sounds there was a kind of stillness I had searched for my entire life. The car stopped in front of my house. I opened the door. The wet wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and damp wood. I was about to say goodnight, but before I could, he stepped closer, stopping directly beneath the porch light. "I've waited too long for this moment," he whispered. His voice wasn't shaky, it was deep, like a confession that didn't require forgiveness. The distance between us vanished. Our breaths mingled, short, real, without defense. The kiss came, deep yet gentle, like the way one holds a familiar hand again without needing to make any promises. No regret, no taking back. Just 2 people who had once lost each other, now finding a piece of themselves in the other's eyes. I didn't know if it was a beginning or an end, only that it was real, and perhaps in life, that's all that matters. Outside, the light swayed through the curtains. Our 2 shadows merged, no longer clearly who was who, only the shape of peace remained. The jazz echoed back, the horn fading into the rain, sounding like the final exhale of a long night. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth on my lips blend with the dying music. It was not a happy ending, nor a romantic reunion. It was just 2 people who had endured mistakes, learning how to remain in the moment without hurting each other anymore. The yellow light from the porch continued to sway, as if the whole world was slowing down its breath, just enough time for us to realize that sometimes, not everyone is given a chance to love again, but everyone can choose to love better.
A year later, I stood in the large room, bathed in the pale golden light of the late afternoon. On the main wall,
A prominent sign with white lettering read, "Fire to Grace, Elena Hart." It was my first exhibition. No clamor, no big advertising, just a small opening for those who had also walked through sorrow. They came not to admire paintings, but to find themselves reflected in them. The room was filled with light, reflected from the glass frames, where the central painting hung still. It depicted the two hands wiping glass, white paint mixed with yellow radiating from the center, creating the sense of the sun just breaking through a layer of haze. People stood around, all silent, not out of sadness, but out of a reluctance to break that radiant stillness. I offered no explanation of the painting's meaning. I didn't need to. If you had ever had to wipe away the dust from your own life, you would understand. I sensed someone approach. I didn't need to look to know it was Mark. He stood beside me, not touching, not speaking. We both gazed at the canvas before us, two hands reaching for the light. The lamps in the room reflected on the glass, making the hands in the painting seem to move, as if someone was still wiping, still searching for what lay behind the haze of the past. Mark spoke softly, almost a breath. "I remember the day you started painting again. Back then, I thought you were trying to forget. Now I know. You were just learning to hold on to what no longer hurts you." I smiled, without turning to him. I didn't forget. It's just that now, when I think of it, I feel lighter. Between us, no more explanations were needed. No more if-onlys, no more whys. Only gratitude that, however late, we had both learned to listen to the other's silence. The light from the glass roof shone down, falling onto his shoulder, onto the hem of my coat, merging on the tiled floor. Without touching, I could still feel the warmth of his presence, just enough to know that some things don't need to start over. They just need to not fade out. I gently turned, directing my gaze toward the back row of seats. There Vivian was sitting, her silver hair neat, a pale coat draped, her hands resting lightly on the small bag in her lap. She didn't approach, didn't crowd the others, just sat still, quiet as a part of the painting itself. As the light reflected on her face, I saw eyes that were softer, gentler than even the last days I had seen her. She smiled, a very slight nod, but enough for me to understand. No need for an apology, no need for an explicit reply. That nod alone was like a final candle lit in a room already full of light. I took a quiet breath, feeling my heart beat steady. Everything around me, the footsteps, the cameras, the wind slipping through the frame, suddenly blurred. Only 3 people remained, each in a different part of the room, but all looking toward the same canvas, where the light radiated like a rising sun. A camera flash briefly flickered, and a small click echoed in the silent space. Ethan was standing by the window, the old camera in his hands, a hint of a smile on his face. He raised the camera, speaking just loud enough for Mark and me to hear. Finally, everyone can see each other. It wasn't a flippant remark. The sentence rang out like the final period at the end of a long score. I turned, looking around the room. The people standing there, friends, students, strangers, were all quiet, following the light pouring over the painting. In that moment, no one was an outsider. Perhaps because they all recognized that the light in that painting was not just mine, but theirs too. The light of those who had been broken, who had been obscured, but still chose to walk out of the darkness. Ethan lowered his camera, his eyes meeting mine. No words of thanks were needed. I knew he understood. Of all the people in this room, he was the only one who had witnessed me from the beginning, when my hand still shook before the foggy glass and the cold words. Now everything was bright, not dazzling, not glaring, but crystal clear, as if someone had just opened all the windows of a house that had been locked for years. I turned to Mark, the light reflecting off his cheek, soft and true. "It's not starting over," I said slowly, clearly. "It's continuing, with genuine light." He nodded, offering no verbal reply, but in his eyes I saw the silent agreement I had longed for my whole life, not to be loved, but to be truly seen. We stood close, without touching, but both examining ourselves through the glass. Reflected were two people who had once dissolved, who had made mistakes, and now only wanted to stand still in this moment, where no one controlled anyone, where nothing needed to be proven. A gentle breeze wafted from the window, making the curtains sway slightly. The scent of lavender lingered, the scent that once choked me, now surprisingly soothing. I realized that forgiveness sometimes doesn't start with, "I forgive you," or "I am sorry," but simply with the moment we dare to look back and no longer feel pain. The late afternoon sun slipped through the glass, settling onto the tiled floor, spreading into 3 long streaks, 3 shadows reflected on the glass wall. Mine, Mark's, and Vivian's. We weren't standing close, but we were all within the same frame of light. The light streaks merged, dissolving boundaries, as if the past had melted into a gentle, enduring glow. No one said anything more. Only the final click of Ethan's camera, small yet distinct. I gently closed my eyes, feeling my heart beat steadily, not fast, not slow. Just enough to hear the sound of life returning. Perhaps love isn't about never breaking. Perhaps the more important thing is learning how to shine again, together. If you have ever walked through a relationship that cost you your light, remember this: the most precious thing is not who you managed to keep, but who you managed to find again. I told this story not for pity, but for those who have been hurt to know it is still possible to stand up. It is still possible to shine again, in your own way. Have you ever gone through a fire to grace of your own? Please leave a comment and share your feelings below this video. I want to hear your story. And if you see yourself anywhere in this journey, please subscribe so you don't miss the next healing stories. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to help your heart find its way back to the light.